With us here in New York, NBC News correspondent Von Hilliard tracking the Trump transition, and senior business correspondent Christine Romans. Also joining us, Washington Post national editor and MSNBC political analyst Philip Rucker. So, Christine, we're seeing the markets already reacting, but talk to us in terms of what goods, what industries, what kind of impact it's going to have on Americans.
Just about everything you touch, it will have an impact on. Cars, for example. Big car industry in Canada, for example, that half of the cars made in Canada are made by American companies, and half of the parts in those cars come from the United States. And all of those parts go back and forth multiple times before a final assembled vehicle is sold. You start putting 25% tariffs on each of those moves, and you're adding to the price of a car. Tomatoes coming from Mexico, any kind of produce coming from Mexico. And a lot of our imports come from Mexico in terms of grocery items. Those would cost more money. And let me explain why. Because the president-elect doesn't believe this or doesn't acknowledge this. But the entity that writes the check for the import tax is the importer, the company that's then going to send it to a grocery store or to a car dealership. So that cost is passed on to consumers. So consumers would face higher prices for things. And in the very near term, the stock market is simply reacting to the fact that it's disruptive. Even if this is just a threat from the president-elect, already people are signing deals to import goods in the next 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 9 weeks. And so they are facing higher prices ahead.
I mean, these three countries, Mexico, Canada, China, imported more than, well, we imported from them more than $1 trillion worth of goods in the last year. If we're expecting these tariffs, prices could go up. Should people start stocking up on certain items?
Well, businesses already have been if they can, but small and medium-sized businesses don't have $500,000 laying around to buy, ingredients now that they might need next year. So the big companies have been preparing, but smaller companies are at a disadvantage. I'd make one last point, too. Mexico and Canada, the president, in his first administration, basically jettisoned NAFTA and made his own USMCA, U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. This would be in violation of his own perfect trade agreement that he made. So raising questions about what that means in terms of the rules-based order for international trade.
That's such a good point. And Vaughn, not only did the president have his own trade deal with a couple of these countries, he threatened other tariffs last time around that he didn't end up following through on. So will he follow through this time?
And he went through with a lot. And let's be very clear. Americans have already lived through a trade war in 2018 and 2019. And you should also expect retaliatory tariffs, right? The U.S. exports $2 trillion worth of goods. And we saw in 2018 and 2019, those countries, Mexico, Canada, China, our European allies, they placed retaliatory tariffs on our goods that American producers and manufacturers who rely on those export markets, whether you're a lobster farmer in Maine or whether you're a soybean producer in Nebraska, they have spent years developing these markets, buyers overseas, but then there was a retaliatory tariff that was placed. And so really, this is just going to call into question what is Donald Trump actually looking for out of any trade deal, whether it be with a new USMCA 2.0 or out of a China trade deal, because the Americans, they suffered losses in 2018, 2019, and 2020 because of the trade war. What does Donald Trump want out of these? It's not quite clear.
And taxpayers kicked in for billions and billions of dollars to make, American farmers whole again after they were retaliated against. So taxpayers paid the price. And consumers paid the price in higher prices.
So, Phil, even before taking office, this is where we're at. Trump's blowing up his own trade agreement. He's picking an economic fight with America's allies and a rival. What do you make of it?
Yeah, well, it shouldn't be surprising, though, because this is exactly what Donald Trump ran on in his campaign all year. These tariffs were at the top of his agenda. He talked about it at virtually every turn. And, he could argue that because he won the presidency and won the popular vote, that there is support for this kind of a dramatic measure on day one. I think it's going to be a real challenge, however, for his incoming economic team, the new Treasury Secretary, as well as some of his foreign policy leaders to really help implement this in a way that doesn't disrupt the U.S. economy too dramatically and that also can keep sort of the global alliances in check. That's going to be a massive challenge for the administration to navigate in those opening days, assuming these tariffs go into place.
So Trump's Treasury Secretary pick, Scott Bessent, said this about the tariffs the day after the election. Watch.
My view, and I don't have a say now yet or maybe ever, but is that I would recommend that tariffs be layered in gradually, which would the price adjustment would be over a period of time.
Vaughn, he recommends the tariffs be gradual. It doesn't sound like what Trump is saying in his tweets or in his social media posts is gradual. Is there a disconnect?
No, and Howard Lutnick, who is going to be the Commerce Secretary, has also talked about having more targeted tariffs because there are some, for example, manufactured parts, like for automobiles, that American manufacturers don't make, which is what requires, right? Like Cummins is a diesel engine company based out of Indiana. There are some parts that they rely on to be coming into the United States to use for their machines. And when you have that tariff that is placed on it, it only increases the size of the price of the engines, which gets to Scott Bessent's point and Howard Lutnick's point, is that there needs to be some more targeted tariffs. But that's not what Donald Trump is pushing for. He's kind of going across the board, tough style of politics approach here. And when you're talking also, come back to what is the goal at the back end of this? And when we go back to that China trade deal, the first go around, Donald Trump justified the trade war in large part to try to cut back on the manipulation of the marketplace by China. Cut down on IP theft. But in all of those stated goals of the Trump administration, they never came to fruition. So Donald Trump is saying he's going to place tariffs on Canada and Mexico to cut down on migration and drugs. This is playing with the economy at the same time you're trying to play with another issue.
Right. It's all about the border. It's coming back to the border.
There's a lot at stake here.
Take a listen to Eric Trump talking about what the purpose is of these tariffs.
You want to allow drugs to come through our southern border? We're going to tariff you. You want to allow them to come through Canada? We're going to tariff you. China, if you're going to allow this stuff to get sold in our country, largely produced in China, we're going to add another 10% to your tariff. We are going to cost your countries, your economies, we're going to cost your businesses billions, hundreds of billions of dollars.
Christine, you touched on this earlier, but the first Trump administration did hit China with some tariffs. What was the outcome of that? Did China feel the pain?
And did try to get China to make some agreements about fentanyl and the things ingredients in drugs, and it didn't work, right? Look, the pain was felt by American producers, American factories, American farmers especially. I mean, American farmers were really hammered, pork producers and whiskey producers and all these things that had these big counter tariffs on. The question is, if President-elect Trump puts on tariffs on day one, are there then counter tariffs? And then that's what becomes a trade war. And that can be really disruptive to supply chains, to prices for American consumers. And again, the person who pays the tariff, the entity that pays the tariff, China is not writing a check for an import tax. That is the importer, the American company that then, if you listen to the earnings calls from these companies, they have been all saying on the record they're going to pass those costs on to American consumers.
Philip, Trump says these countries could easily stop the flow of fentanyl, but we have to point out the Department of Homeland Security says the vast majority of fentanyl crossing the border is being smuggled in by U.S. citizens in their personal vehicles. So is this policy really about stopping fentanyl?
Well, clearly, Trump has made that argument. He has said this is a retaliation for the flow of fentanyl as well as the flow of undocumented migrants. But it's not as simple as he might portray. And it's not as if, the leaders of Mexico, for example, can just flip a switch and decide to stop all flow of fentanyl and it would suddenly stop. This is a very complicated issue in terms of the drug war and the drug trade. It's illicit, it's illegal, but it is happening and happening through so many different geopolitical forces. And so it's not as simple as the president-elect portrays, but it is what he says is a motivating factor for these tariffs that he wants to impose on day one.
Phil, Trump has made a lot of big promises for day one. Tariffs, deportations, dozens of executive orders at the ready. Is there any skepticism inside his team that he can actually implement these things on day one?
Well, they know how hard it's going to be to implement these things on day one. But one of the effects of having made all of these personnel decisions in terms of the cabinet leaders so quickly after the election is that they now have a period of time to actually plan to execute this in terms of governing, to get those executive orders in place, to figure out that agenda, and to create sort of get the paper flow ready so that this can all fall into place on day one in a more orderly fashion. he has finished assembling this cabinet much, much sooner than he did 8 years ago during the 2016 transition. And so that's a sign that at least they have the time now to try to prepare for this and develop a plan of action.